Welcome to the Energy Conversations podcast, your go-to source for unpacking the complexities of the South African energy sector. My name is Thokozile Zambane. I will be your guide, and every 2 weeks, we will be on a journey of bridging the knowledge gap surrounding South Africa's energy sector and the transition to a low-carbon economy. Welcome back to the Energy Conversations podcast, where we break down the complexities of South Africa's energy sector into digestible insights. I am your host, Thokozile Zambane, and in today's episode titled Understanding Liquid Fuels, we aim to unpack South Africa's liquid fuels industry. The liquid fuels industry is a crucial component of our economy and provides energy for transportation, industrial, and residential purposes. In today's episode, we are joined by two seasoned experts, Dr. Rod Crompton from the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School, as well as Fani Tshifularo, the Executive Director at the South African Petroleum Industry Association. But before we dig into today's topic, let's begin with some introductions. Dr. Rod, let me begin with you. Please, could you briefly share about your role in the South African energy sector?
I've had various roles, but my current role is as a visiting adjunct professor at the African Energy Leadership Center at Wits Business School. So we offer postgraduate courses at honours level, master's and PhD level in energy leadership.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Rod. Finally, please could you share briefly about your role in the energy sector?
I lead the South African Petroleum Industry Association, which is an industry body. I'm the executive director. So we represent the member companies on issues of common interest. We focus solely on the issues of refining, wholesaling and distribution of petroleum products in South Africa. Obviously, with the changing landscape, we will adjust ourselves accordingly to recognize that, the future of enabling mobility is not going to only be dependent on liquid fuels. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Fani. And in positioning today's conversation, I'd like us to begin with a brief overview of the liquid fuels industry in South Africa. Dr. Rod, could you provide a brief history of South Africa's liquid fuels industry?
Sure. It begins in the early 1900s with the advent of motor vehicles and Henry Ford's famous Model T Ford in 1908. And in those early days, liquid fuels were sold from general dealers and trading stores. It later morphed into petrol stations or garages, as we sometimes call them, because in the early days, you could also get your vehicle repaired at the same place where you bought fuel, but that's faded away. So up until the war, there were various government measures taken to support the oil companies in the market and to limit competition. During the Second World War, war measures were introduced to regulate fuel much more directly, and after the war as well, and that's continued for the last 70 years. It's taken various slightly different forms, but they all tend to have as their the overall policy objective is import substitution industrialization, and support for the participants in the industry in one part or another. As to regards manufacturing of liquid fuel in South Africa, that began in the 1930s with Satmar mining Torbanite shales to produce a local fuel. And then in the 1950s, government got involved with Sasol 1, making fuels from coal, and the private sector started building oil refineries, the first one being in 1954 in Durban, the Mobil refinery. And through the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, oil refineries were built with government incentives. And then in 73, there was the first OPEC oil crisis, which tripled oil prices or more than tripled it. And shortly after that, in 1974, the United Nations took a resolution to impose oil sanctions on apartheid. And that led to massive interventions in our local market by the state. They decided to build Sasol 2 and 3 in Secunda, which are still running to some extent. And it had a massive market intervention with disruptions to the privately owned oil refineries and to the markets. And it's still an issue to this day. There are still court cases going on as a result of those issues. Later on in the 80s, the government intervened again with Mosgas, a gas to liquids plant in Mossel Bay, currently owned by PetroSA, but it's run out of gas, so it stopped working. So we've seen in the last few years the reduction in manufacturing. So the government regulatory incentives to encourage refining are not working anymore. And we've seen Engen close their refinery, Shell and BP have closed their refinery, the Mosgas refinery or PetroSA refinery have closed. Others are talking about it. Astron closed for quite a long time. And what we're seeing now is big international trading companies like Glencore, they bought the Caltex majority share, and Vitol bought the Engen majority share, and now Shell is leaving, and we suspect another big global trader, or maybe one of those two, will take their share, and so on. So there's a transformation happening, and we're seeing in the retail market also big international players coming into the retail market. So there's still interest in the market, but not much in refining anymore. The South African market is a bit small, and the risk of building a big new world-scale refinery with the threat of electric vehicles and hydrogen-powered vehicles and compressed natural gas vehicles and other propulsive technologies, it seems refiners don't want to take the risk of building refineries in this country. So that's where we find ourselves today. That's a whole book in 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Dr. If we can continue from that and maybe just unpacking and understanding the various activities that are then involved in the liquid fuels industry. Fani, if I could bring you in here, what are the key upstream and downstream activities that have been taking place in South Africa, and how has this changed over time? I think it just adds on to what Dr. Rod has started us off on.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think Dr. Crompton has touched in some of the issues, I mean, on the downstream space. But let me just start on the upstream, where we have seen some interest, I mean, going. We have seen exploration of oil and gas on the west and east coast of our country. But obviously this, I mean, obviously has attracted attention from the NGOs, who are pretty much, I mean, opposing people to continue to exploit fossil fuels. And that has like slowed down the process a little bit. I mean, South Africa as a region itself, it has really never been considered an oil province. But obviously that is changing with the developments that we are seeing, the discoveries of Namibia and some favorable exploration in the East Coast. But I mean, there's a big debate in terms of like whether this is going to lead into some, I mean, production activities or not, because some people, they look into like government or regulatory framework as like misguided, and it doesn't seem to create a necessary environment for people to proceed beyond, I mean, the exploration that we have seen up to now. So to sum up, there's very little like upstream activities in South Africa in terms of production, but yes, there's a lot of exploration. People are very like eager to go forward. I mean, that can only be facilitated by the necessary accompanying government policy and necessary regulatory framework. Just to touch on the downstream activities, which Dr. Crompton has already touched on that, I think what we have seen in the recent past, the reconfiguration of the sector as a whole, with some closure of refineries and pause for some of the refineries, that has led to significant increase in the importation of refined products into South Africa. Prior that, I mean, change or those changes, I mean, South Africa was importing very little, but with this, I mean, changes, we have seen that, I mean, we are importing roughly 35% of our petrol requirements, and we also importing diesel has increased significantly. Almost 70% of our diesel requirements is like met by imports. And a product like LPG, almost 80% of that is like met by imports. I mean, we'll estimate that, I mean, other byproducts such as bitumen probably were importing the same amount, I mean, 80% level. And I think, I mean, recently there's been like some notable withdrawals by companies, which Dr. Crompton has touched on that, but I mean, I just want to really look into some of the reasons that are advanced as to why this is the case. I think primarily because this is a regulated market, you will see that, I mean, people, they will cite that as the reason, and then it will be followed by climate change, I mean, concerns. And companies, when it comes to prices or investors, they will cite, I mean, the reason or the inability to recover their investment. We've seen this particularly when it comes to investment that's required in order to reduce, I mean, carbon emissions, and also like investment for upgrading the refineries. People, they said, I mean, because they cannot invest, they cannot recover the investment, therefore they cannot, I mean, invest. So these are some of the broader discussion, I mean, consideration that are made when companies take decisions, I mean, in terms of whether we stay in a region or in a country or not. But with climate change, it's another like a factor which is being considered, especially by international companies, because they've got their own ambitions in terms of reduction of carbon, I mean, footprint. And that is likely to be like, I mean, considered when they look at the various assets that they own across the globe. And we're going to see more and more these decisions, like, I mean, taken by various, I mean, companies. But maybe just to round up this, I mean, as far as like decarbonization of the transport sector in South Africa, I think as far as like moving away from fuels or petroleum products, we're still a long way. I mean, really, in terms of seeing, I mean, the reduction in dependence in petroleum products in South Africa. Yes, in the developed, I mean, countries, yes, we're going to see faster pace, but here, like in our region, it will be a little bit slower. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Fani. I think from a South African or an average, ordinary South African perspective, when we're speaking about liquid fuels, the first thing that comes to mind and what impacts most South Africans daily is petrol, and specifically fuel prices. Dr. Rod, what are the main factors that influence petrol prices, and why are petrol prices lower in neighboring countries?
Okay, so petrol prices are regulated in South Africa. Diesel prices are not regulated. And the main factors that influence the petrol price are global prices. There's a big global trade in petrol. And because we are primarily an importer, we depend on those global prices. But those global prices are traded in US dollars, and we are buying with South African rands. So the rand US dollar exchange rate is another factor that plays a big role. So those two factors, the international prices of petrol and the rand dollar exchange rate, are the big monthly effects that you see in the monthly changes to the petrol price. Other factors are local price, regulated price margins for retailers, wholesalers, and refineries, and the way the system is set up to support local refineries. Now, in the neighboring countries, they don't have those measures to support local refineries. They don't have local refineries, for that matter, except in Zimbabwe, where they produce biofuels from sugarcane and things like that. There they have subsidies to support that industry, but I guess that's not strictly refining. And the other big difference in the neighboring countries is the tax they impose on petrol and diesel is much lower than the tax South Africa imposes on petrol and diesel. So those are the big factors that result in lower prices in neighboring countries.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Rod. Fani, just to bring you back into the conversation here, Dr. Rod had noted a number of closures of refineries. What impact has the closure of 3 South African oil refineries had in the past few years? What has that had on the petrol price?
At face value, one will be very quick to say, like, look, there will be very little impact in terms of, the fuel pricing methodology, because it is largely based on the import parity mechanism. And however, remember, when you've got a refinery, and you also import product, it gives you that balance. So when the margins are good in the refinery, that helps you as well. But when you are largely dependent on the importation of petroleum products, I mean, like the two main factors that will always be at play, like as Dr. Crompton has said, it would be international product price at international market, which we call the FOB, free on board price, and the freight. I mean, that's the cost of transportation of these products into the country. And because you are now largely dependent on imports, and you are not the only country that's importing, we have seen, the freight, movement has been swing in measures upswing for the longest period. At one point, because of that, it has become a big problem for the buyers of this product, because there was a disconnect between what is in the regulatory framework and what is actually happening in the market itself. Because South Africa itself is such a small market, as much as when we look at ourselves in the region, we think we're big, but we're very tiny. So we can't really influence, the demand at the global level. So we really depend, on what is happening globally. Like the big players who really affect the prices would be like a typical heavyweights, the Saudis, and the major consumers like the Chinese and Indians. Those are a big who can really, influence the price movement. But as South Africa, we will not say really the disappearance of refineries has led to the increase in fuel prices. There are much bigger factors at play than our own activities within our borders.
Thank you very much, Fani. Dr. Rod, back to you. And so we've recently seen in Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland and Namibia the establishment of state-owned oil companies and what looks to be a drive to build domestic storage facilities. What are your thoughts on this? Wouldn't it make sense for these countries to perhaps keep existing arrangements instead of spending resources to duplicate infrastructure?
Yes, the real reason I think is the existing arrangements are no longer working to their satisfaction. South Africa always traditionally supplied most of the fuel for those countries, but over the last 15 years or so, we've seen pipeline problems, congestion in the pipelines. Most of those countries don't have pipelines connected to South African pipelines, so it goes from the end of the pipeline into rail or road transport to get to those countries. And we've had significant problems with rail. As you know, a lot of the rail infrastructure has been stolen by thieves and crooks and vandals. And in road transport, we have similar problems, petrol bombing road tankers, communities blocking highways and blocking roads with burning tires. And, it's not reliable anymore. South Africa is not a reliable supplier. So security of supply is always an important driver for government policies. And so they've decided to become more self-reliant. I think it's also fair to say that the opportunities for looting are much better if you have your own infrastructure in your own country rather than being dependent on South Africa's.
I hear you. It makes absolute sense, though, because at the end of the day, each of those countries want to actually ensure that they are able to supply or ensure a stable fuel supply for their citizens. So I guess that would make absolute sense. Fani, you touched on decarbonization, and as the world moves towards electric vehicles, what impact will this have on the liquid fuels industry? And from a SAPIA perspective, what is SAPIA's strategy for managing this change? And I think a lot of South Africans are just interested in learning about how SAPIA is then preparing for the electric vehicle revolution, as well as then the plans that SAPIA would have to address then the potential impacts on SAPIA operations.
Yeah, let me just start to say at an organizational level, at the association level, we are very mindful of the changes in the road transport space. We do know that the new energy vehicles, they will require different sort of fuels. power them. They are not going to entirely be dependent on the petroleum products. They will be like dependent on electricity and hydrogen and all those kind of things. We are very much mindful of that, and we are very much mindful of our individual members' response, particularly at the global level, not here in South Africa. So, and what is clear is that EVs are really going to affect the petrol consumption, and it's a technology that you are not going to stop. I think what is really the differentiator is the speed at which that technology is going to penetrate our market, but it will affect the petrol consumption. That's where we see it very clearly going to start to impact into the industry. But again, there are two major factors that affect the rollout of EVs or the penetration of electric vehicles into the market. One is the price at which they are sold in the market. And secondly, the logistics that is required in order to refuel this technology. We do know that in the case of South Africa, these cars comes very expensive. And there's no talk of subsidizing them like in other markets. The only talk from government is that they will subsidize the companies who are exporting these cars to Europe and other markets that require it. So, and until we get intervention like in other markets to support consumers in terms of accessing and affordability of these vehicles, the speed at which they roll out is going to be very slow. In terms of fast charging infrastructure, it is very critical for the uptake of EVs, combined with the price at which they are charged. And we think that you will need to address these two issues if you want to make significant progress. And without addressing that, the progress is going to be very slow. When coming back to the companies themselves, SAPIA members, I think how they address this transition, it will be really entirely up to individual company strategy on how they want to do it. There are those probably who want to be the market leader in terms of how they integrate the technology within their own system. So that's really in a nutshell how we see the EV story in our market.
Thank you very much for that, Fani. And in keeping then with the conversation around decarbonization, we then recognize that it goes beyond just, the introduction of electric vehicles, but it then also brings renewable fuels into consideration. Dr. Rod, the impact of decarbonization goes beyond electric vehicles and brings renewable fuels into consideration. What are the main challenges associated with integrating renewable liquid fuels such as biodiesel or ethanol into existing distribution networks? And how might advancements in areas such as biofuels, carbon capture and utilization, or synthetic fuels impact the future trajectory of the liquid fuels industry in South Africa?
Well, the short answer about biofuels is they're not commercially competitive. I want to give you a quote from Adam Tooze, who's a global energy expert, talking about subsidies to maize farmers in the United States who use it to make ethanol. He calls it a ruinously inefficient and environmentally damaging creature of subsidies that are too big to kill. Ruinously inefficient, environmentally damaging, requires big subsidies. In the United States, about 9 Rand a litre. So can you imagine adding 9 Rand a litre to petrol prices in South Africa? What the response to that would be. So basically, biofuels are just not within the realm of possibility in the South African state at this point in time, because the state cannot subsidize to the level that would be required for them to happen. Now, you also mentioned carbon capture and storage and utilization. That's just a pipe dream. Yes, technically it can be done, but nobody is doing it because it's not commercially viable. It's just a pipe dream that's being experimented with in some countries that can afford to do it. I wouldn't like to see, as it's happening, South African taxpayers' money being wasted on attempts to prove up this technology, which is a long, long way from being commercially viable. You also talked about synthetic fuels. So in this country, when we talk about synthetic fuels, we mean fuels made from coal or fuels made from natural gas. Well, nobody in the world is building refineries to make fuels from coal, except the Chinese. But in the rest of the world, nobody's doing that. There's no investment case to make fuel from coal, certainly not in South Africa. Gas to liquids depends on cheap gas being available, and normally those plants have to be built on top of the wellhead where the gas comes out the ground or out of the sea. So we've got this one plant which is mothballed in Mossel Bay because it's run out of gas. If there could be a cheap source of gas found to supply it, it might be able to be reopened, but there's all sorts of funny things going on around that company and that plant. It's not really clear what's going to happen. What is happening, though, is small-scale liquefied natural gas is entering the South African market and being used for industrial and vehicle propulsion needs. So is compressed natural gas, which is different from liquefied natural gas. That's already happening with several hundred minibus taxis having been converted and other vehicles following. And so those are happening, but the South African problem with regard to gas is there isn't any. We haven't found any yet, and the regulatory dispensation is so discouraging of investment that it's unlikely that even when the new Mineral and Petroleum, well, the Petroleum Resources Development Act is enacted by the President, I understand it's on his desk, waiting for him to enact it. It's such poor legislation that it's unlikely to encourage anybody. So propulsion of vehicles from natural gas, except for this little field they found near Virginia in the Free State, which is propelling some trucks. There's talk of other fields in Secunda's backyard, but so far very little has actually been proven. But if they find gas there, then large amounts, then the story will change completely. But as I say, the regulatory dispensation is not conducive.
Thank you for that, Dr. Rod. You've touched on quite a number of issues, and I think what also becomes quite clear, especially in the debate or conversations around renewable fuels, is that we then haven't quite gotten to a place where we're able to, have put in the necessary R&D to ensure that then they don't become environmentally damaging, and obviously just where we are from a global focus perspective, the focus has been on ensuring sustainable environmental practices. Dr. Fani, what recent innovations or advancements have been made in South Africa's liquid fuels industry to address environmental concerns?
I like that you call me Dr. Fani.
Sorry, oh my God. I think I'm speaking into your life.
No, I like that. So I think if we look at the question of environmental protection, environmental concerns, like how have we addressed that? I think you need to ask yourself, like, from what perspective, because there are various angles that you need to consider this, whether you're talking from production, consumption perspective, in terms of complying with the minimum emissions act, in terms of the Air Quality Act, whether you're talking about in terms of water usage and the spillages that take place within, the production, activities, or within, the supply chain. So all these, they are addressed, very differently and in an appropriate manner by the operators themselves, who happen to be our members. For instance, if you look at the production sites, in terms of how they deal with the water, because we know, like in our country, water is a very scarce resource. So there's a lot of recycling of water within, the production, facilities. And the affluent, also are handled according to the licensing requirements in terms of the local standards within each municipality. So companies as well, you will see from time to time that they refurbish their own, service station or the forecourts. And one of the activities that take place when they do that is to upgrade and they replace the equipment, especially the underground tanks, and they will clear up, all the spillages that will have taken up in the past. And if we look from the consumption perspective in terms of the fuels themselves, there's been a lot of progress in terms of addressing harmful issues that affect the environment, especially if you look in terms of sulfur reduction in fuels. We have seen recently, with as recent as 2020, with the reduction of sulfur in the bunker fuels. This is in line with the international mandate from the International Maritime Organization, where there have been a serious reduction in terms of sulfur content in the bunker fuels. Locally, what is the next biggest step in terms of some of the interventions that are going to result in the better sort of improvement in the air that we breathe in terms of the air quality? It will be the introduction of clean fuels 2. These are equivalent of Euro 5 fuels in 2027. This will ensure that in South Africa, the quality of fuel is further tightened to the benefit of the citizens. We're going to see that both petrol and diesel, they'll be kept at 10 ppm sulfur content. The benzene on petrol is going to be further reduced to 1%. And all these are good developments in terms of the air, the quality of air that we breathe. Those are the serious interventions that we're going to see happening in the next 2 or 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Fani. Dr. Rod, what have been or what are the global trends on liquid fuels, and how will the just energy transition impact what we know today?
There's a great global concern, as Fani just mentioned, about emissions from fossil fuels. And oil and gas are some of those fossil fuels, and they have very significant emissions. So there's great concern in some countries, like in Western Europe, European Union countries and North American countries, but not so much in China and India, which are big centers of consumption, and Indonesia and things like that. So we've got a market contestation going on between the old guard, which is the liquid fuels we know, petrol and diesel, and the new people entering the block, so to speak, the electric vehicles, compressed natural gas vehicles, other gas vehicles, hydrogen vehicles. So I think in future, we're going to see a proliferation of different fuels for propelling vehicles of different sizes, might use different types. And it largely depends on the subsidies available and the penalties awarded to them. So if you look at some European cities now, they are prohibiting internal combustion engines within the city centre in a demarcated part of the city. You may not drive an internal combustion engine in that zone. So that sort of citywide regulation has an impact on demand, has an impact on people's choice of vehicle, and so on and so forth. And there are governments, of course, which impose taxes on emissions. The South African government is doing it as well. We already have a tax on motor vehicles according to their emissions. So typically larger engines have more emissions and they have a heavier tax than smaller engines, and various things like that. So it's an ongoing, a moving development. Whether the just energy transition comes into it or not, I think the world is still trying to understand what is this thing called the just energy transition. In South Africa, there are various papers produced by various government and private agencies. Everybody claims they know what it means, but I'm not sure that there's a global consensus about what it really means. And there certainly isn't a global consensus even about global warming. The big oil producing and coal mining countries, they don't, they are flat earthers. They don't think there's global warming, or they don't want to acknowledge it. So there's a big contestation going on. And as a result of global warming, we're having floods, insurance risks are going up, insurance is going up. We're having droughts and fires and all this sort of thing. So that's all those things messed up together are like the mixed masala, which is going to determine how particular countries respond.
Thank you for that. And I guess from a South African perspective, we don't operate in isolation and are greatly impacted by global trends, and as well as, I mean, in the past year, fluctuating global oil prices. Fani, how has the industry adapted to these fluctuating global oil prices in the past year? And what strategies have been effective in trying to maintain that stability? And I think the point, or what matters then to our listeners on this podcast, is, and how do these fluctuations impact the average South African?
Yeah, so I think stability is quite a foreign concept in this industry because, I mean, it's characterized by like fluctuations in prices all the time. So hence you see prices going up and down, I mean, every month, and people never get to understand that at one stage the price were going down. But the really biggest concern is the fluctuations, the way they happen, because they can be large. At one stage, I mean, like the way it happens from month to month, it can be large to an extent. It can wipe out a small company just like that. That's how, like, I mean, a significant, I mean, these swings there are. And I think that's probably is one of the reasons why you see that the industry is dominated by large, I mean, companies who have got a big balance sheets, because you need a lot of money to participate in this industry precisely because of this fluctuation. As much as like the industry is regulated, that regulation does not really cushion you from these fluctuations, because pretty much everything is done after a month and after effect. And I mean, what really typically happen in the industry when these fluctuations happen, especially if it's an upswing for continuous period of time, it means the companies themselves, they have to borrow money in order to buy product, because they can only be compensated after selling the product, after it has been accounted by the regulator and compensated through the fuel pricing mechanism, through the slate mechanism itself. So, but these are the kind of things that are not very visible to the motorist, because I mean, I remember at one stage 2 years ago, the motorists, I mean, in South Africa, they were owing the companies something like 15 billion rand. This is the money that, I mean, companies have to go out and borrow from the banks in order to be able to continue to supply the market. But the system itself, it was not geared to deal with such, I mean, large upswings or fluctuations. So there has to be very quick behind the scene discussions between the industry and the regulator to see how can we address the issue. Because if we don't address the issue, the country is going to run dry, because the companies themselves, they're going to run out of money. So this is why you have a slate levy mechanism that get adjusted from time to time to try to balance the money that the oil companies from time to time, they'll be owing the motorists. Sometimes it's the motorists owing, I mean, the companies themselves. So all this needs to be managed, because unfortunately or fortunately, well, I think unfortunately, fluctuations are the nature of the game in this industry. But you need to have a way of how, through the regulation that we have, because as much as diesel is not regulated, I mean, at the pump, but there is still a slate levy mechanism which needs to support the diesel, I mean, market itself. So all of these things, they affect the motorist, because when the slate is under recovering, you will see that, I mean, beyond the FOB, the price will also be adjusted by the slate levy, which will be in the price structure as well. So that's how really effectively it works in practice.
Thank you very much for that, Fani. And I mean, a key point in terms of regulation, and just also, and tying back to the conversation we've been having around pricing and the factors that contribute to it, and understanding how, you know, the liquid fuels industry works from a regulatory perspective. What we know from the energy sector, and specifically gas and electricity prices, we know that NERSA regulates those prices. Dr. Rod, why doesn't NERSA regulate petrol prices?
When NERSA was established, and by the way, it also regulates petroleum pipelines, part of the value chain in liquid fuels, but it was established to modernize economic regulation in South Africa by having an independent regulator made up of a board, rather than the old-fashioned model where you had a politician as the regulator. And in South Africa's petrol regulation, that politician is the Minister of Energy or Mineral Resources Energy or whatever the name might be in any particular year. But the minister responsible for energy is the regulator of the petrol price. So in 2005, the plan was that petrol price regulation would move to NERSA. It never has happened. Now we know there have been several ministers in that portfolio since 2005. We assume they didn't want to do it. We did a big study for National Treasury in 2020 looking at some of these things. And one of the things we observed is that, a regulator regulates the petrol price down the whole value chain. So the minister's regulating the refinery margin, the wholesale margin, the retail margin, and so on. What we observed from the numbers is that money is being, if you like, taken away from refiners and wholesalers and given to retailers. So the retail margin is growing fantastically, and others are not. So it's for a politician regulating a commodity like petrol, it's a source of power. And they can exercise that power and they can benefit certain constituencies or not, and disadvantage other constituencies according to their political whip. That is not good economic regulation, because politicians, as we know, they have a short-term tenure, 5 years in this country, and they plan around that 5-year tenure. And their main plan is to get re-elected. Regulators, economic regulators, are not dependent on elections. They are independent, like judges, and they can make independent decisions. So petrol pricing has never managed to take that step from old-fashioned political regulation to modern, independent economic regulation.
Thank you for that, Dr. Rod. It would be interesting to see what happens in future then regarding the regulation of those prices. Fani, back to you. So SAPIA aims to ensure the availability and cost effectiveness of liquid fuels in South Africa. How do you as an organization balance these goals with global competitive pressures as well as local economic conditions in South Africa?
Yeah, maybe just to clarify, I think it's the function of ensuring availability of fuel or ensuring security of supply and the competitiveness that lies squarely in the hands of the regulator, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. However, what we really seek to achieve or to advance is that, the price regulation or the regulatory framework, it has to be fair to both the consumers and the suppliers of fuels. Neither party should subsidize another party. Earlier on, I've highlighted a situation at one stage, the suppliers have to go out and borrow money and pay interest on this money, which they don't get, by the way, compensated on the interest that they will have paid for borrowing money to buy products. The slate levy will only compensate for the actual movement of the cost of the product in terms of the free on board or international product prices. So that is what we advocate against. We want the regulatory framework that is fair to both parties, the consumers and the fuel companies themselves. And I think if you think about the ensuring of stability of fuel supply or security of supply of petroleum products, it's kind of a joint function, as much as like in terms of the legislative mandate, it lies with government or Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. But the implementers or implementation agencies are the companies themselves who are players in the market. And one thing that we do very well in the fuel market, we do it better than the electricity supply industry. We've got a lot of issues where, like at any given stage, we are trying to sort out, issues to make sure that there's continuous supply of products in the country so that the country does not run dry. We've got forums that are led by the department, and they've got multiple stakeholders, all the people in the supply chain. They come to the party. We said, now put your individual company interest aside. Let's focus on what is required for South Africa. We all look at making sure that there is fuel available in the country. So that's pretty much what we are more interested in as SAPIA, to say, let's ensure that this country does not run dry. And let's have a regulatory system, fuel pricing system that is fair to everybody. No party should subsidize another party.
Thank you for that, Fani. And I think also, in terms, if we're discussing or talking around availability and cost effectiveness, I think what is also quite key is ensuring that whatever liquid fuel is then being supplied, the quality of that liquid fuel then also becomes quite important. And Dr. Rod, we've heard a number of stories around how a lot of diesel in South Africa is being diluted with paraffin, which speaks to no longer maintaining that quality of diesel that we then have flowing. Who is doing this, and what impact does this have for motorists in South Africa?
The impact for motorists is simple. It's damaging the engines of their vehicles, diesel-powered vehicles. So that's what motorists have to worry about. Who's doing it? The answer is simple: thieves and crooks. What they're doing is the paraffin is subject to VAT, but diesel is subject to the fuel levy. VAT is lower than the fuel levy, so they take the lower one and they spike that into diesel and they evade tax. So it's a criminal offense and they need to be prosecuted. And Fani will know better than me, but if you look at the recent demand for paraffin, it's skyrocketing, which tells you that this illegal and wrong and damaging behavior is increasing all the time. So authorities really need to come down hard on these thieves and crooks.
Thank you for that, Dr. Rod. And Fani, perhaps a last question then for you. How is the government working with industry stakeholders to promote investment in infrastructure and technologies that can enhance the sustainability and resilience of South Africa's liquid fuel sector?
Yeah. So, you know what, this is an area where, when it comes to promotion of investment by government at large, it's really lacking. I'm sure you've heard Dr. Crompton talking about, the upstream activities, we're not even so sure whether we're going to even reach, production level of some of these, discoveries, because the investors, they're saying we don't have adequate regulatory environment for that investment to take place, because you're talking about a lot of money. You need to be settled in terms of what are the rules of participating, and you can't take years and years trying to work on a bill of on an act of parliament. You need to be swift, because the investment is not only waiting for you as South Africans. We are not that special. There are many other nations who are very friendly to the investors. So those are the things that we need to be mindful of as a country as well. But having said that, there are a number of initiatives that have been pretty much led by government, but they don't really get traction. A very good example is the issue of biofuels, industrial strategy, which was introduced back in, I think, 2007. But we have not seen even, a liter of biofuels out there, blended with fossil fuel, diesel. Why? Because the regulatory framework is not really that conducive for that to happen. We do know that right now, the companies, because of the pressures they are facing in order to decarbonize the fuel pool, they would like to add, a bit of ethanol and biodiesel into their fuel. There's a big talk of sustainable aviation fuels. All of these, they can take shape and move forward if government set up the necessary regulatory framework, which will enable that to happen. I mean, strange enough, all these activities, if they were to take place, they create jobs. In a country like ourselves, where we need a lot of jobs, we should prioritize any of the initiatives that leads to job creation. But we don't really see that to be the case, which is like always, disappointing. Because if you just need to look at the whole issue of new energy vehicles that people they are telling us is the future. But what is our approach as a government? It's really not that supportive until people or the investors start to put pressure to say, unless if you don't take a decision by this date, we're gonna be like history, as a country. So I think we need government to prioritize, the issues that are raised by investors, especially things that will lead to investment in the country, because otherwise we will be left with no manufacturing capacity in the country. We have seen it with so many other sectors.
Thank you for that, Fani, and raising some key points. I think the strengthening of the regulatory environment and also incentivizing that foreign direct investment into helping to develop this sector and develop the economy broadly is something that definitely needs to be prioritized and pushed by the government. And that brings us to the end of this installment of the Energy Conversations podcast. I want to extend my sincerest gratitude to our esteemed guests for sharing their invaluable insights and expertise. Today, we continued the journey to demystify South Africa's energy landscape and empower ordinary South African citizens. Join us next time as we continue with our exploration. Until then, remember that the power to change our energy future lies within each of us. Thank you for tuning in, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for joining us on the Energy Conversations podcast, powered by Bayaka Infrastructure Partners, an authorized financial services provider, and the African Energy Leadership Center at the Wits Business School. Together, we are committed to empowering communities and fostering meaningful dialogue around the South African energy sector. Remember to subscribe of the South African energy sector. My name is Thokozile Zambane. I will be your guide, and every 2 weeks, we will be on a journey of bridging the knowledge gap surrounding South Africa's energy sector and the transition to a low-carbon economy.